Joko Beck, the founder of Ordinary Mind, used to talk quite a lot about how we tend to treat life in terms of self versus world. Our tendency to want to control, and then our bafflement when things don't turn out the way we hoped they would. She always used to say in that particular way of hers, well, self v world, who do you think is going to win? And we can tend to assume that this is just part of this kind of Buddhist idea of the self, and it's all ridiculous and dreadful. But it's not quite that simple, or in some ways quite that dreadful. Am I really fundamentally so stupid? Is this just part of eternal human nature? Where do these ideas come from? Even if we're sitting knowing that we can't get it wrong, even if we're sitting down and just, for this particular moment, we haven't got a pop song playing in our head, or thinking about breakfast, or worrying about paying the mortgage, even if things are still, we're still approaching Azazen with ideas, and as soon as we start reflecting on our experiencing, we're going to shape our experiencing according to our ideas. So this idea of a self which is different and separate and not part of the world, is it just simply, like the amoeba, we reach out and grab whatever we can and digest it, and that's just the nature of the world? Or can we talk more coherently? Can we talk about the history of this way of approaching the world? Not just thinking, being in the world, approaching in the world. And ultimately, any of this is only important as far as it shapes our actions. It shapes what we do, how we are, how we manifest as us in the world. And I think one of the most fundamental ideas in terms of separation, you can go back to the story of Adam and Eve. And this is quite interesting because obviously it's an old story, and it comes out of the Jewish Talmud. But when it comes to Christianity feels that it needs to reshape this somewhat. We're not going to change the story, but we have a particular problem. If our God is all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful, why does he set Adam up for the fall? If he knows that Adam's going to eat the apple, if he knows he's arranged the world, that this is going to happen, why? Why would you do this? Even for something as unknowable, as ineffable as this transcendental absolute deity. Why? And pretty much, and I'm simplifying as always, the original great father of the church, St. Augustine, writing about the 4th century, so this is free will. Adam has to have free will. His choice at the moment of deciding, apple, she's eaten it, do I eat it? That choice has to be free, absolutely free. And for that he has to be capable of being entirely separate, unaffected by anything. Unaffected by what's going on, his experience in the garden, what he does or doesn't think is going to happen because he's been told not to do it. Just asked you to do one thing, asked you not to do one thing, and you had to go and do it. None of this applies None of this compromises the absolute freedom of his choice. And this is the beginnings of our idea of some kind of absolute free will. And we're not going into free will and determinism here. We're just talking about this idea of an absolutely free choice, starting from this one instance. So God has to allow Adam this absolutely free choice, and of course the rest follows. But that this is literally a separation, and whereas in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve have been part of creation, they're rational, they're thinking, but they're no different from the animals or the trees. They're just part of God's creation. Lovely. But then, knowledge of good and evil, the angel with the sword cast out. And suddenly they're not simply part of creation anymore. They're standing looking at creation, and they're looking at themselves, they're looking at their own bodies, seeing them naked, feeling shame, feeling disgust. Everything's changed because they're now, in this fundamental sense, separate. Because they're the one thing which is separate from creation as a whole. And of course, what does God offer in compensation for that? Well, dominion. Dominion over nature. And actually, dominion means literally, we're talking about ownership. They own nature, they can dispose of nature. Nature is now there for their benefit. It's separate. It's theirs to use. So that's a massively important change, and really the beginnings of this sense of, no, I'm this, well, I'm what? Well, it's wind the story on a bit. Most societies in the history of the world have been fundamentally relational. Who you are, who you really are, is your relationships with everybody else. And that's no less true of feudal society, or as we're starting to call it now, manorial society in the Middle Ages. Everybody has a place and they know their place. Okay, so we've got kings, nobles, knights. But for our purposes, the really interesting thing here is the amount of commonness that there is. So, you go out and you work your fields. They aren't your private fields. If you're a landlord, you get them from the person that you owe fealty to. But equally, if you're a peasant, these are your strips. But they're part of the common field, and you work them all together, and you plough and sow together, and you harvest together. And that's your bit, but it's part of a communal activity. You can't be thrown off your land. You don't own your land, but you can't be thrown off your land. Why? Because there's customs. Because relational customs. You have your place, and it's a place in relation to everybody else. And in that sense, you're not free at all. Nobody's free in that sense, absolutely. You can't just leave, but equally, you have your place and nobody can take your place away from you. Now we might go back and say, well, hang on. Surely free choice is important in terms of the human soul. If you're imagining things that you've got this soul which is uniquely yours for going to heaven or hell, going to be damned or end up in paradise. That's perfectly true. But in terms of this relational society, it's interesting in popular depictions of hell. Who is going to hell? Well, it's the landlord that doesn't behave. It's the bishop who doesn't take the job seriously. It's not you and me. there's no real sense of individualization at this level. And as I say, the sense of the common possession, common wealth is really important and central in this relational world. Now, what happens in Europe, and it's very much in Europe that it begins, in the 16th, 17th century, is that things start to change. And one of the most obvious demonstrations of this change is that we get what we call the voyages of discovery. Hey, we've discovered America, we've discovered India, we've discovered this. And obviously that's in, it says something that we use that terminology, doesn't it? Because obviously the people that lived there already for thousands of years don't really need discovering. But we already have that attitude set up, and in the 16th, 17th century we have the beginnings of these voyages of discovery, which quickly lead to conquest, which lead to colonization, which lead to eventually things like the slave trade. But what's interesting, or as if that wasn't interesting enough, that we're treating suddenly the whole world as our dominion. What's really interesting is that this is happening at home as well. And so the common field is being split up into separately and independently owned units with landlords. The peasants are being thrown off their land. What do? Where can they go? They become a problem. We make laws about vagabonds, lock them up, put them in workhouses, corral them into factories. You used to be able to go and graze your pigs alongside your neighbour's pigs on the common land. The common land is now fenced, it's enclosed. We put a line round it, we enclose it, and it's now the landlord's, and you can't put your pigs there. So you've lost your fields, but don't think you're going to make up for it here. Or the woods, the common woods that you could go and gather firewood in. Well, that's now owned, and it's now, I don't know, a grouse shooting range or, whatever. It's private. It's now enclosed. And that's the beginning of the whole process, which ends up as the Industrial Revolution, which ends up as actual capitalism as we know it. But it starts with, parcelling out things as being private, as being owned, as that which an individual, one person, has dominion over. Okay, so far so good, and follow me, bear with. There's one particular thinker who I think it's now beginning to be recognised that this is like a moment when something happens, and it's not suddenly that John Locke, because that's the guy's name, 17th century British philosopher, had these thoughts and then suddenly everything changed. Obviously it wasn't like that at all. But it's a point where you can say, oh, this is interesting. It's actually where it comes back to meditation and how we think about ourselves and how we experience ourselves in the world. This is actually why it's pretty important. Most people know about slightly earlier French philosopher René Descartes and the kind of division of everything basically into a kind of spiritual substance, which we'll call mind, and stuff, extended matter. And you get problems like, well, what are animals then? And so, well, effectively, they're like clockwork. They do their thing because they don't have this mind, this special mind. And of course, Descartes can't actually work out and spends decades trying to work out, well, how does mind actually relate to matter? I mean, if I think I want to raise my hand, how does that actually happen? And of course, nowadays you can go, oh, well, it's all to do with neurons firing in the brain and that sends signals to muscles. But it doesn't actually answer anything because we're still stuck with matter, neurons firing off little electric charges, and mind, whatever that is. Okay. So Descartes kind of divides out stuff and thinky stuff. But what's interesting is that Locke takes it one stage further, and it's a hugely important step because he actually uses, it's not literally the first time I think, but in its contemporary sense, the word consciousness. Now if you think about how often we use the word consciousness and how often we use it in Buddhism, for heaven's sake, and you go to the Heart Sutra, and consciousness, that word doesn't exist in English until the late 17th century. It doesn't exist in any other language either. And in actual fact, it's kind of a shift. And this is where we go back to Christianity and the word conscience. And conscience is that still small voice. Well, we see it as God's still small voice, or a kind of common human faculty that we share that says, hang on a minute. And of course, it's in terms of conscience that Adam went wrong. The little voice didn't say, don't bite the apple, Adam. But it wasn't his conscience. It was conscience. Something we all share. And so Locke takes the idea of conscience, and it's there in Descartes, and turns it into first an abstraction, consciousness, but then my consciousness. And suddenly I've got a name for this sense of being me. What's happening here? Well, it's my consciousness. And this is really fascinating because, now I've got a name for the sense of me. But it's also weirdly a kind of split, a kind of separation as well, because now, there's this consciousness, which is me. How does that operate? What's it all about? And Locke is a brilliant philosopher. We're not saying he's, it's a particular view, but it's a marvellously subtle and sophisticated view. Okay, what makes me me? Memory. Memory of sensation. And in fact, the thing which Locke is actually best known for traditionally is the idea of the blank slate and nurture, not nature, that our environment shapes us. Why? Because everything we are is down to sense impressions. It's down to the sense impressions that we get, and then the sense that we make of those sense impressions and our memory. So basically what constitutes me is my property in the sense of my memory, my ideas, my hopes, my aspirations. This is what makes me me. This is uniquely mine. And this is really, he calls it a person rather than an individual, but this is really the beginning of the sense of the modern individual. Separate. I'm me, I'm not you, because I have all my property. My sensations, my memories, my ideas, they're mine. And why am I calling it property? Well, that's actually what Locke does. That I have property in my body. Okay, so I'm not actually my body. No, because I am my consciousness, my sense of me. Okay, so I have property in I own my body. I own the rights to it. I own the ability to dispose of it in whatever way I think fit. That's a legal right, amongst other things. And actually, whoa, we've got law in here as well, suddenly. What makes something mine? Well, sense impressions that I have, but also my actions, things that I do, and the consequences of those actions. So it's kind of ethical and moral responsibility as well. How do I make something mine? Well, Locke actually argues, okay, it's because I incorporate into that thing my labour. So I take this, bland, brute nature, which I've been given dominion over, and Locke is a very serious Christian, takes this absolutely seriously. Being given, and I incorporate the labour of my body. My body is mine, I own it, and so that which bits of nature I work on become mine. You can understand this very simply. I'm wandering in the woods, I find a stick, I think, I need a walking stick, yes, get my knife out, whittle the end off nicely, oh, that'll do, mine. I've taken a bit of nature and I've turned it into mine. Now, of course, what Locke is, this has two interesting consequences which point in opposite directions. The first thing of which is what Locke actually means by labour here is, no, little man, I go and point at you and I say, whittle that stick for me. Because actually this was on my land, which I own. So now I've incorporated my labour. Okay, you actually did it, but I gave you a florin for it, or a penny or whatever. And suddenly we've got the ability to actually extend me from this point inside my head, my consciousness, through my body, extended out into the world. And I can own the world, and I can act on the world, and I can act in nature. And so everything which isn't owned by somebody else, I can actually claim by incorporating my labour in it, or getting somebody else to do the job, because I can pay them, because. And it's this wonderful, strange thing that I create a me, which is still in a weird way relational, but actually sees itself as being entirely separate, sees itself as being independent, sees itself as having this quality of absolute free will, unaffected by circumstances, but also sees itself as potentially having dominion over everything. If I can come to own it. So what I'm actually doing is I'm creating an enclosure. I'm creating an enclosure for me, that I'm now entirely separate from this world as a whole. And I sit and I sally out into the world from this space which I own, and I use that to own other things, whether I incorporate them into me as memory, as the basic thing, or whether it's actually incorporating them in as things I call mine and I can then control. And then, of course, we start getting into the question of, well, okay, I'm me. I have this individual consciousness, which is what defines me as me. So where does that leave you, and you, and you, and you, and you, and you, and everybody else? And if everybody owns their body, and everybody owns the right to their own labour, what are the circumstances by which I can claim? I can claim your field, or I can claim North America, your traditional tribal hunting ground, your whatever it is, wherever it is. That's a story for another time, but that's where this leads. Both enclosing me in my head, enclosing, grabbing whatever I can from this world. That's what creates, in our modern contemporary sense, self v world. And just as there was an awful lot of fear involved in invading and conquering the world, in colonizing the world, actually it's a pretty lonely place, isn't it? It's like being in your expat enclave, or patrolling the ramparts of the slave fort. The world out there looks scary. It looks worrying. I've got to control it. Unless I control the world, somebody's going to control me. Potentially it's a terrifying place. So if we really want to see ourselves as separate in this sense, and in a sense the whole of our practice is allowing us that sense of not separate, that sense of connection, which so much of our thinking and acting is about blocking us from, walling us up inside the fort of consciousness, the fort of individuality. That's who we are. And we can't force this. We can't change how we think about the world like that, because that would be exercising exactly the kind of free will that none of us possess. Doesn't mean we're wind up like clockwork, it just means we're part of the world. We're relational. We're not separate. So if in Joko's terms we just stop self versus world in this moment or this moment, we have an opportunity to experience ourselves and experience the world and experience the connection between the two differently. But I've deliberately drawn the connection between what happens out in the world, whether that's economics or me at work or me at home with my family, and what goes on in my head, because that's the scope of the relational. It's important that we see those connections, and this idea of the individual conquering self with property, which I'm tending to call mastery, so we'll come back to that. Not my idea, nick the term, but I think it's really useful. Turns up in so many aspects of life, whether that's economics or gender politics or, straightforward imperialism, wherever. And it gives us a tool to relate this experience, this little thought, this little feeling in my body and how I approach that to the big stuff. Comes back to saying of Thich Nhat Hanh's, we can't make peace, we have to be peace. It begins with us, with each of us. Where can we take it?